You remember being in school and learning about what happened in the first century, the second century, the third century. Learned about the Romans and how and their conquest and where they took over things and how their empire grew. Where did we get that information? I would suggest that it comes from two sources. Written documents that we accept as reliable and archaeological evidence. So how do we get these written documents, and how do we determine whether they were reliable or not? Well, this is the second part of our proof video for the New Testament and the Bible. Is it true? Is it reliable? Well, here's one way we can determine that. Can it stand up to other period writers who we accept as reliable? The fact is, it does more than stand up. It far surpasses. Let me read you a few names that I can't even pronounce. Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Demosthenes, Caesar, Livy, Tacitus, Pliny Secundus. These guys were the writers who we assume to be reliable. This is where we get the information in the early 1st and 2nd centuries. Now let's compare them to the New Testament in three different ways. First of all, you have the number of copies ways. Now, the Bible, the New Testament, has 5,600 plus copies in the original language dating back before the 5th century. Now, how many other of these other writers that we count as reliable have that number? Well, none of them have that number. The next closest is about 643. And if you count, along with the New Testament, the other writers in the other languages, the other copies we have in other languages, there's about 24,000 copies in the New Testament. And only the second place is Homer and the Iliad, about 640. That's 5%. That's hardly even able to stand up next to each other. So now we begin to see that the number of copies makes the New Testament very reliable. But what about the time gap? The gap in between the original writing and when we have the first copies. Well, I'm going to show you right now a little table that will explain that to you. And we're looking together here at Homer. You have a time gap from where it was written 800 BC and found in 400 BC. The time gap there is about 400 years. You have many other years, 1350, 1300, 1300, 1400, 1000, 400, 1000, 1750. Now let's look at the Bible. 114 copies and fragments 50 years after. As you can see, that's just unbelievable compared to the other books that we have and as we count reliable. 100 years, 150, 225. The point is that this book and the time gap and the number of copies far outweighs the other books that we count as reliable. Then you ask yourself, well, yes, maybe back then we had all those copies, but the Bible has been changed tons and tons of times since then. Well, no, it hasn't. It is true that there are some misspelled words in some copies and some added one words or two words, and even in one case where it was a positive thing for this particular king, they added a phrase. But if we take all of those copies, those 24,000 copies, and we compare them to each other, and we put down only the words that show up in all of them, or most of them, we can have the original, unmessed with text that the disciples and the apostles and others wrote. Now, isn't that amazing? We have the original text, and the time gap is so small, and the number of copies is so small. As far as manuscripts go, this is the most, scholars agree on this, this is the most reliable piece of ancient writing that we have overall. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?